whether anybody got any sleep last night. Um, and it appears that you got adequate sleep anyway. You're here, so thank you for that. One of the joys of having hearing loss is you can take your hearing aids out on 4th of July and get a good night's sleep.
Don't feel it in your feet.
I know, you can feel it, but you don't have to listen to it. Okay, well, we've got, I think, a fairly interesting text in front of us that's both empowering and maddening all at the same time. So let me start out by asking, did anybody have any questions about the text or about the video or anything like that? All right, I'm not hearing anything in the room or seeing anything in the chat. So, well, let's get started then. Let's spend a little time with verse 10, shall we? Okay, so in terms of migration story in the book of Genesis so far, we've actually had several. You have Adam and Eve being expelled from the Garden of Eden to east of Eden, where now they have to till the ground in a different way. They don't have a garden that God planted. They have work to do. That's in chapter 3 of Genesis. In chapter 4 is where Cain murders Abel. And God confronts Cain, says the blood of your brother is crying out from the ground, the Adamah, that played such an important role in creation and all of that. And Cain is banished. We don't know who Cain married. we can't quite keep up with how they all had spouses when actually they're just Adam, Eve, and 3 boys. This is a story. It's not a history. And but Cain is banished, and he even says, if anyone finds me wandering, they're going to kill me. And as an act of revenge for Abel's murder. Who would do the killing, we're not sure. But God puts a mark on Cain of some sort that protects him. But we could argue that Cain was a second migrant, right? After Adam and Eve, he's sent away. And then you got the story of the Tower of Babel there in chapter 11. Where the people come together to build a tower to the sky, and God makes the curious reference, if they do this, there's no telling what they can do. It's almost like they're getting too powerful for their own good. And God confuses their languages, and in doing so, they're all scattered to different parts of the world. Now, in some respects, that story seems obviously to be, this is Jerry's favorite term, an etiological story. Right? A story about the origin, answering the question, why are there different people, different places, and they talk funny? Why do those people talk funny? That's how children experience it. Their language is the norm, and they hear something else, and it's funny. And this probably originated as a story to describe why there are just diverse peoples in the world and why their languages are all different. I think historically that's not why, but this is a story to kind of explain that and put the emphasis on hubris, right, in building that tall tower, and it ends with migration to different parts of the world. Now, I think the word migration is not always a bad word by any means. We have lots of plants that we now call native plants that once upon a time weren't native plants. And a bird ate the seed and flew a couple 100 miles and then pooped out the seed. And then it started growing. And behold, it's been here a long time. The migration has been happening for years. And we assume that the earliest Homo sapien communities were probably in Africa that then migrated. I was reading an interesting article about that this morning. And again, I don't remember if it's from the New York Times or LA Times or the Atlantic. or Delancey place, the daily reading. But it mentioned that the evidence is starting to suggest that Homo sapien community, not Homo erectus, not Neanderthal, not Homo, one of the others, they had already migrated. The Homo sapien communities migrated out of Africa up into Eurasia for a short time and then mostly came back. And it wasn't for another 1,000 years or so that they actually migrated. That kind of movement suggests that migration sometimes is not just wanderlust, but it's being driven by something, either driven by famine or driven back by famine, driven by war or driven back by war. So migration can be, frankly, a natural part of the human community, as it is for animals and plants. But most often, there's tragedy of some sort involved because of the enormous cost of picking up roots, leaving your family and so forth. That's why I thought that first verse last week of God telling Abram to go from your country, your father's house, your kindred, that's a real, that shows the price of migration. So in verse 10, we have another kind of migration. This is not the migration based on God's call. It's a migration based on famines. I'm trying to read a chat. Hang on a second. So Bill Postma is asking, why didn't he just stay in Canaan? Right? God says, I want you to go to the land I will show you when it gets to Shechem. You remember? God said, this is the land that you and your family will inherit. And he built an altar. And then he left again. And then he went to that little spot between Bethel and Ai, and he built another altar and called on the name of the Lord. That's the evolution of religion. Then he left again, heading toward the Negev, which you can see on your map on the back, is that desert region, kind of in between Israel's more well-known names and Egypt. The story does not tell us why Abram left that spot between Bethel and Ai and went toward the Negev. We just don't know. We don't know. But I would say, remember that his father, Terah, had intended to go from the land of Ur up to Haran, down to Canaan, that basically the same map that Abram ended up traveling. But when they got to Haran, his father ended up staying there. He could have broken his leg. I mean, we don't know why these things happen and why people make these decisions. So Bill, it doesn't make sense, for our way of thinking, if God's calling Abram to go to Canaan and to make that his land, why didn't he just stay in Shechem? Why didn't he stay near Bethel or Ai? Why didn't he just settle down and build a house? And we don't know. What we get is a picture of a wandering Aramean who's going to be traveling. And it's going to be a while before they're settled. So remember, it's actually going to be after they leave Egypt that the people of Israel come back and actually conquer this place. So this is years later, not just a few generations. During the book of Genesis, the people of Israel are never settled. They're always on the move. The book of Genesis ends with them in Egypt, right? So they've got the promise of a land, but they don't have the reality of it. Maybe that's the importance of the phrase that's in those first few verses. It says, at that time, the Canaanites were living in Canaan. This is not Israel's land by any means. Okay. Verse 10 reads, now there was a famine in the land, and we assume that means the land of Canaan, because that's where Abram is when this verse opens up. It seems like maybe Egypt had a better system of aqueducts and viaducts and irrigation and stuff, and a better system of dealing with floods and droughts. We're going to see again at the end of Genesis that Egypt is a place where people flee during a time of famine. Don't forget that in Matthew's birth story about Jesus, Egypt is where the Holy Family went when Herod had all of the children killed. This is a place of refuge. It might always stick in our head as the big bad Egypt because that's where they were held as slaves. And I imagine that's true in most Jewish heads, even back when these scriptures were first written. But it also is a place of refuge, and has saved many a life, including Abram and Lot and Sarah and all the people in their house. They're down in Egypt. All right. And so look at the structure of verse 10. There was a famine in the land, so Abram went down to Egypt to reside there as an alien, for the famine was severe in the land. So anytime you see a repetition like that, it's trying to lay down a point. But what's curious is from this point on, the famine's not mentioned at all. And when Abram and Sarah leave and go back up to Canaan, it's not like, for the famine had subsided. It doesn't say that. And famines are not seasonal, right? These are things that happen over a long stretch of time. The middle part of that 10th verse is where I really want to draw your attention. I mentioned in the video that the word ger, that's the Hebrew term, is the verb is translated here in our translation as to live as an alien. In other places, it simply said he went there to live. Some say to sojourn. So that term, how we translate that term is very important. And again, I'll circle back to this, but it was an article by Theodore Hybert from McCormick Seminary, who really informed me that how key this term is. And his argument is that the word immigrant is the most meaningful translation, not sojourner, not traveler, not alien because of the kind of weird connotations of that word, almost the harsh connotations of it. Maybe not stranger, but his biggest argument is this: Abram and his family are often depicted by Bible teachers as nomadic or semi-nomadic, right? So you have in mind camels, and they live on the fringes of society, and they're used to being on the go. That's how they are. They're like the RV folk, right? Who don't give me a house, I'm moving. Some people would say this is I don't love this term, but the Roma people, the gypsies, they're often called. They kind of live on the edge of society, and they're people of the earth. They're not grounded. The problem with that description is that nomadic people and semi-nomadic people rarely went to the larger city. That was not their place. And they didn't establish crops, because that ties you down. Abraham and his people are constantly talked in terms of, are described in terms of agricultural farming. They have crops, and they go to the city. They go to Shechem. They they established themselves between Bethel and Ai. These are major routes. This is not where nomads go. They stay along the edge. And so his argument is that the whole depiction of these folks as semi-nomadic or nomadic people has really been kind of misleading. When we think of them as immigrants, we realize that they're not in their happy place living on the fringes like a nomadic people. They don't care what country they're in. No, they're in Shechem. It matters what country you're in. They're down in Egypt, close to Pharaoh. So it matters because when you cross those administrative borders, you also cross cultural borders, linguistic borders, all of those things. You are seen as an other, and yet that's where you're trying to make your life. So the word immigrant probably captured the day-to-day experience better than just thinking they're a bunch of nomadic people who never did lay down the roots. Does that make sense? All right. Yes.
If you use the term immigrant, is there not the implication that there is a permanence for the end of their journey?
It might. It might and it might not. That article I was reading today, in fact, well, an article in the LA Times about a Venezuelan community in Florida and how they're struggling with their identity. And it was interesting. A lot of the people they interviewed, it's their intention to go back to Venezuela. That's where they want to be. This is where they have to be to escape violence. So I think there are probably subcategories of immigrants, right? Which is why we speak of people seeking asylum, of refugees. Those are different experiences, but the larger catch-all term would be immigrants, and you got the temporary and your homesteaders, as it were, who will settle. It's yet to be seen what Abram's doing. He's just been called to go. He hasn't been called to stop yet. But I want you to, on Sunday and Saturday during our worship service, as part of our prayer, we're going to mention several migration stories in the Bible driven by famine. Think about the role of famine. Abram goes down to Egypt because of famine. Isaac ended up moving to take refuge among the Philistines. That's Abraham's son, because of famine. Abraham's grandchildren, the 12 sons of Israel, Jacob and his son, they will go to Egypt as a result of famine. The book of Ruth begins with the family of Naomi going to Moab. You know, when you hear Egypt, Moab, Philistine, you know these are often enemy territories. But they go to Moab because of a famine. That's how Ruth ends up in the genealogical line of David and Jesus. She's a Moabite. David cries out to the Lord for help because of a famine, asking for wisdom and what to do. Elisha sends a widow off for 7 years as a refuge somewhere because of a famine. The prophets Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Amos all talk about an impending famine in their warnings. And even in the New Testament, the story of the prodigal son, the reason he had to end up eating pig food is not just that he ran out of money, but there was a famine. There was a famine, and you couldn't rely on typical modes of hospitality. In the book of Acts, there are at least 2 mentions of famines. One's a prophet named Agabus, who says there's going to be a famine in the land in Jerusalem, and the new Gentile Christian communities take up money to send to Jerusalem. And don't forget, the key point of Jesus fasting in the wilderness is afterwards he was famished. And that's when he's tempted. So I think the role of famine in the scriptures, we ought to just pay attention to that. This is a real life issue. And it results not only sometimes in death and suffering, but also in migration and people being really dislocated from one place and relocated to another. Being driven by famine to Egypt is going to be echoed in the last part of Genesis. And that's how Joseph, is in Egypt. That's how he reconciles with his brothers if they're driven there to beg for food. It's not a small thing, this verse 10. There's a lot to it. It looks like it's just kind of kicking off the story, but it's putting the story within a very familiar stream of story. Okay, enough of that. Now let's get to Abraham and how ratty this guy is, right? Okay, yeah. So just a quick survey, reading this story. Let me read verses 11 through 13, and then I'll ask you a question. When he was about to enter Egypt, he said to his wife Sarah, "I know well that you are a woman beautiful in appearance." When you hear that at the opening line, it's going to get worse, right? "I know well that you are a woman beautiful in appearance. And when the Egyptians see you, they will say, 'This is his wife.' Then they will kill me, but they will let you live." Okay, just hold on to that presumption for a moment. It may be true. It may not be true. I don't know. I don't know if Abram's view of Egyptians is any better than the Egyptian view of the Mesopotamians. But he's going into strange territory with different customs, and he's presuming the worst. You see what's happening here? So let's keep reading. Verse 13, "Say you are my sister, so that it will go well with me because of you, and that my life may be spared on your account." Okay, so just reading that for a second, how many of you think Abram is quite a schmuck in this story? Can I see you? All right. Yeah. So what do we do with Abram, who's a schmuck, right? I think that's not a terrible word, but it feels like the right one here. What do we do with somebody who's a hero one moment and a schmuck the next? Okay, this is a really serious question. What do we do with somebody who's a real hero one moment and a schmuck the next? In what sense is Abram a hero? Well, God told him, leave everything you know and all the securities and all of that go with it, and go away from that, and I'll show you where to go. And Abram does it. He does it. I think we should honor that as an incredible response to God's call. Abram ends up building altars and calling on the name of the Lord. This is a real heroic act of faith. Why would someone who's that heroic in one moment trust God enough to leave everything, all of his securities behind? Why would he suddenly turn into kind of a schmuck and scheme, as it were, to save his skin at the price of his wife's integrity, perhaps, instead of just saying, God will take care of us. Honey, you're beautiful, but God will take care of us. He doesn't say that. Honey, you're beautiful. We got to do something about this. What makes someone go from a hero to a schmuck? And I want to argue that what makes someone go from a hero to a schmuck is the reality of the migrant experience. You're going to a place where you have no rights. You have no rights. You have no rights. Now, look, now we have a Universal Declaration of Human Rights that the UN passed. Now we have some sense that even the alien among you must be treated with some measure of respect. You just can't go throwing rocks at them just because you don't like them or anything like that, right? So they're, even today, they're the limited scope of rights that you have, but it is hugely limited. And so you go into a place where you don't have rights and you are subject to their practices and their definition of what's appropriate and what's not. And if their definition might or might not be true, but you think that's going in. If their definition is that if I see a good looking woman and I want her in my place and she's married to somebody, all I have to do is off that guy and then she's single and I can take her in. There's nothing in the story that says the Egyptians actually thought that way. But that part of the migrant experience is you don't know how they think, right? You only know what you think they think. You only know what their reputation is. It's a daring act to travel, and Abram's been told to travel, to go. He hasn't been told to stop. And so he goes, and he knows going into Egypt. These words to me, just yes, he's a schmuck. Yes, he's worried about saving his own skin at the price of whatever this takes on his spouse. But don't get stuck there. Realize that this is a real insight into how dangerous and how insecure, how unprotected Abram felt throughout this entire thing. You go into other territories, you're subject to them, to their whims, to their weird ways, to their unjust, cruel ways, even if, or at least to your imagination of what they're about. So I'm not excusing Abram in any sense, but I am saying that in addition to saying, boy, I'm glad I'm not married to that guy, I think you might also want to say, well, I'm glad I'm not in that position. Because who knows what sacrifices you will have to make to survive when you are taken from your land, your people, your country, your kin, and put into a place where they do things the way they do it, whether you like it or not. See what I mean? Mm-hmm. So I want us to be both angry with Abram and sympathetic to some extent with what's going on here. I think this really shows the powerlessness with which migrants take that leap. Got a couple of chat comments here, so let me check in on that. Eddie's remembering the Ingalls family from the little house on the prairie, frequently moving, farming for a year or two, and then moving, ending up in hostile territory and so forth. Yeah. Joanne makes a comment that this was written after the Exodus, right? This is probably written, it looks like this was probably written around the time of the kingdom of David and Solomon and so forth. So yes, Egypt looms large in the reader's imagination as being, you know what they'll do to you. They'll welcome you as friends and enslave you within, a few generations. So yeah, this is a real threat. Whether Abram's absolutely right or not, we don't know, but the fact that he feels threatened is beyond question. Okay. So let's see what happens. And starting with verse 14, when Abram entered Egypt, the Egyptians saw that the woman was very beautiful. Okay, so he was not wrong about that. Sarah's beauty was so stunning. I mean, we started out hearing that Sarah was getting on in age and barren, but now she's beautiful. Whatever. When the officials of Pharaoh saw her, they praised her to Pharaoh, and the woman was taken into Pharaoh's house. That is not a small statement. So I did encourage you in the video to read the first couple of chapters of Esther. Esther. That's a story. I think the story of Esther is a retelling of the story of Joseph. just like the story of Daniel, the retelling of the story of Joseph. And they're interesting stories because they talk about the experience of the Israelites in a foreign imperial court. And the book of Esther actually starts out with a queen named Vashti. She's the queen, married to Xerxes or Ahasuerus, and he wants her to come to a party where he and his drunken fraternity brothers are all having a good time to show off her beauty, which probably requires some immodesty or at least some show of herself that's not fitting for a queen, and she refuses to do it. So King Xerxes asks his frat brothers what he should do about it, and they say you ought to banish that woman. Yeah, thank you, Lydia, for saying what I won't say in camera. Queen Vashti is banished. So the book of Esther starts with banishing her for having integrity. And then Esther is one of many women who are being considered as the next queen. And the process is that they're brought into the harem and they're given baths of ass's milk and other such luxurious products you can only buy at Victoria's Secret. And then each of them is brought in to see if they please the king. Delicate language. I don't know exactly what's happened, but I don't know what's happened to Sarah either. And there's a lot left unsaid in this story for us to imagine. There's also the issue of time. I was asking you to just because it only takes a few seconds to read the story doesn't mean it went by that quickly, right? By the time they leave, apparently the threat of the famine has subsided. So what happens to this story if you imagine this is a period of 6 years? How long would Sarah have been part of Pharaoh's harem? I mean, if he can haul off and just bring a good-looking woman into his house just because she's a good-looking woman, who knows how many women are in there? I mean, she's not the only pretty woman in Egypt. It's awful. This is awful. This is awful for Sarah. Sarah's another person that I think in one moment she's going to be very noble and at least enduring, and in another moment she's going to be a schmuck. She's going to do things that are very unkind. And this is what we get with these folks. You know, when you read the stories in Genesis, usually it's the chosen one who's kind of the rascal, and it's the non-chosen ones who show more nobility. So Abram was right in that she's beautiful, and that as a beautiful woman, somebody with power will want to take her and put her in their home. We don't know if he was right that they would have said, well, let's kill this guy so we can have this woman. We don't know about that part. Maybe that was their reputation. You might have been right. In which case, you're looking at immigrants doing whatever they have to do to survive. Or maybe he was wrong and just imagined the worst, and looking at immigrants doing what they think they have to do to survive. One of those is true. Okay. Sarah is taken to Pharaoh's home. And Pharaoh, I think, comes off rather noble in this story. He gives Abram all kinds of stuff. Abram actually ends up doing pretty well here, as it were. But look at verse 17. But the Lord afflicted Pharaoh and his house with great plague because of Sarah, Abram's wife. Now, the narrator knows it all, and we know nothing, right? We don't know what plague. We don't know how they figured out that this is because of Sarah. I mean, she could have been one of 30 women in the harem, and just because you have plagues doesn't mean somebody in the harem shouldn't be there. I mean, where do you draw that conclusion, right? The narrator doesn't tell us; they just know, and so they tell us what the facts are. But when you hear the word plagues and Egypt together, then we go back to Joanne's comment in the chat here that, you know, you're hearing it as somebody who knows the story of the people of Israel in slavery in Egypt, God sending the 10 plagues before Pharaoh, a different Pharaoh, allows them to leave. But the key to verse 17 is this is the one and only thing God does in this story. The only mention of God in this story. And what God is doing is taking Abram's scheme, which may have been the only desperate option they felt they had, and it's not going well because instead of just leaving her alone, there's Sarah in Pharaoh's harem for who knows how long, and God intervenes so that they can be rescued from that. And then the rest of it is the conversation with Pharaoh and Abram. Pharaoh called Abram, verse 18, Pharaoh called Abram and said, "What is this you've done to me? Why didn't you tell me she was your wife?" Now, how did he know that, right? How did that? Again, we're not being told that. Now then, here's your wife, take her and be gone. And Pharaoh gave his men the orders concerning him. They set him on his way with his wife and all that he had. So looks like he gets to keep all the donkey and the sheep and the male and female critters. Yes, ma'am.
All along, Abram was head of a large group of people when they came to Egypt.
Right,
He wasn't just he and his wife.
right,
He had his sons, their family. So you don't really murder that union when they had a whole bunch of people behind them. So I think he had a little clout with saying this is not my wife.
Well, maybe. I think we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves in the story. So yes, he has people.
Trying to say to
Right.
all the other people.
Right. Yeah, that's a great point. So yes, he has people. He doesn't have sons. No sons at this point. But
It says he took his son and his wife. Abram was 75 and he took his wife Sarah. Oh, and his brother's son.
yeah, that's
I'm
Lot.
sorry.
Right. That he's got his nephew whose father had died. So he's got Lot, he's got Sarah, and Abram. That's the family. They've got slaves. I guess that's the best thing to call them. People they had acquired while they were still in Haran, and they do have goods. That's when they leave Haran and come down. When they're in Egypt, they increase that considerably. And so they receive sheep. This is in verse, what is that, 16. They receive sheep, oxen, male donkeys, male and female slaves, female donkeys, and camels. Now, but your point is really well taken because, number one, when Abram is saving his skin, and that's how he puts it, he's also saving perhaps the lives of all the others, right? Because if they were to attack him and the others tried to defend him, they're done for. In other stories, Abram and all of his slaves are going to be something of a pretty effective army. And they are going to be powerful. So I think you're anticipating this point a little bit, but that is going to happen with Abram in this story. So he's not without something. He's got some people, something. He comes down now. He's got a lot of people, a lot of things, or it sounds like that anyway. And he goes back up to Canaan, which still is foreign territory, as it were. So yeah. All right. Let me see if there's anything I meant to say that I haven't said. I just really think in verses, well, the whole sister-wife thing. I mentioned this a couple weeks ago, just to remind you, and I put it on your handout. I think that that's going to happen 3 times altogether. Twice it's Abraham with Sarah, and once it's Isaac with Rebecca. Okay. Walter Brueggemann argues that this is probably an old story, a moral tale, or some kind of daring story that was popular in that region that the writers adopted for different purposes. But he said you put them all three together, whether you're in Genesis 12 or Genesis 20 or Genesis 26, he said reading them together, looking at the similarities and differences, it just doesn't explain anything. It just seems to be a story that kind of works for these writers, and they use it several times to explain the daring do and the drama of this experience. That's that's interesting. I do think in verses 14 through 17, what we really ought to hear is the power dynamics. I think we have to be attentive. That's why I think the language we use, they're not traveling, they're not on vacation, they're not on a sightseeing tour. They are subject to all kinds of danger, and they don't have power. That's why verse 17 is so important. God jumps in and saves them from the ruthless power dynamic there.
Well, this community coming into a larger community could also become a festering sore.
It can. Yeah, we don't have a sense of what the numbers are yet, right? And they're there, and Abram's flock has increased, but we don't know how big and how threatening they are. But that exactly is the dynamic that happens the next time Israel's family goes to Egypt. So you remember at the end of the book of Genesis, Joseph is a second in command in Egypt. He has the wisdom from God and a dream that tells him they're going to have 7 years of abundance and followed by 7 years of famine. And so he tells Pharaoh, this is what you do during these 7 years of abundance. We just take lots and lots of crops from people and we store them so that during the 7 years of famine, they're the only people with food. This basically is what takes Pharaoh from being a relatively common king of Egypt to being an emperor, an empire, because people come and they bring you money, you give them food. Year 2, they bring you more money, you give them food. Year 3, they're out of money, but you can have their land if you give them food. And suddenly Pharaoh, he's an emperor. I mean, the empire is expanding due to the wisdom of Joseph. Initially, when Joseph's brothers and his father, Jacob or Israel, come to Pharaoh, they're invited to stay and they're honored as welcome guests. And they reside there for the next 400 years. That's a long time. The book of Exodus kind of begins by saying there arose a Pharaoh that didn't know Joseph, right? So the Pharaoh is the title and it's handed down. And eventually there's a Pharaoh that says, Joseph who? And notice what happens with the story there. The Egyptians start complaining that the immigrants are multiplying like rabbits. And if we don't do something about them, they're going to outnumber us. We're going to lose our culture. Those Latinos, I mean, those Israelites, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's everybody thinks they're saying smart things today, and I'm like, that shit's been around for thousands of years, man. You just join the company of the obnoxious, right? Yes, Jared.
Just understand that it isn't history. We have all this history of pharaohs of Egypt and creating these great monuments going back thousands of years. Where does this story seemingly fit within that? And I say it because even if you go to the oldest of the constructed monuments, it took tens of thousands of men working for 30 years to build this, which means there are a lot of people there. So that pharaoh to be interested in, in some herder who brings over even a lot of cows or well, sheep and goats or whatever. The power dynamics would have been really very different. And if it doesn't fit for history, then this is very much a Jewish story of how they see themselves in the world, which could be very different from how the world saw them.
Oh, yeah. In fact, I'm absolutely sure it is. Yes. Yeah, and so you bring up something that's really, I think, really important. Anytime you see a structure that's fabulous, just say to yourself, I wonder how many people died making this thing, right? Because, we're starting to learn that many of these ancient cultures had pretty amazing architectural skills, because you put a house crew there and say build a temple, they'd be like, I don't know how to do that stuff. And that includes Solomon's temple that he built for God, after which he built a palace for himself. Solomon was known for being a very cruel taskmaster. This was expensive, took a lot of taxes, took a lot of manpower, and typically that manpower would be slaves. If it's not slaves, it's poor people. If it's not poor people, it's indentured servants who have fallen into debt, right? This whole sense of building these institutional edifices like that, that this was very labor intensive and rather cruel. That's one of the complaints when Solomon dies and his son becomes king. The people are like, please don't treat us like your dad did. It was hard to put up with. And his son, of course, says, you think he was bad? Wait till you get a load of me, right? And that's why the kingdom of Israel broke up into Judah and Israel. So whether it's Solomon or the pharaohs, or great structures from Chinese civilization, wherever, Amazon, wherever you see these giant structures, you need to know that it's probably not the community getting together and saying, hey, let's build this thing. Probably someone saying, hey, let's get those people to build this thing. And there's a lot of cruelty, pain, cost, and so forth involved. So where exactly in history, like if we went to Egypt and we were able to kind of go and read some of the etchings and the runes and this and that, where exactly this would fall, not really sure. I'm going to think Abraham is typically dated. Maybe you're, geography and history are not my thing. That's why I gave you a map and hardly referred to it. I don't know. I don't know exactly. And it would be interesting to see how whatever remnants of Egyptian history we have match this. But if the Israelites are telling one kind of story and the Egyptians are telling another, that is par for the course. I mean, what do we know about ancient Chinese civilizations? They were so sophisticated. They did think beyond our imagination. There was some history book, I remember someone lifted up a sentence out of it that talked about the superiority of the West, because we had magnets and gunpowder, and he named 3 things, all of which were invented in China. All of them. But he was telling history, right? So we always get history from our perspective. I think we should take for granted that's happened. Yes, ma'am.
Well, you were talking about the moral of the story and between the Pharaoh and the beautiful Sarah. But in the Middle East and in parts of Asia, we have men that go into homes that are powerful and take the oldest daughter or the beautiful daughter. I mean, those kind of things still occur in our lifetime. So it isn't, it's telling us about a moral, but I mean, it's something that we still deal with in certain areas.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, so that's, and that's a layer we haven't addressed exactly so far, but the whole misogyny of the story. Like if you just have to take that for granted in this story. And it's true of the people in the story. And I think to a large extent, it's still true of the people writing the story. That they don't see women nearly as equal as men in value or in erudition or anything like that. And it's almost a woman's beauty. That's the thing that makes her, exceptional, outstanding. But I would say, Shirley, that we get news stories of this kind of misogyny happening in other cultures and other countries. It's plenty of it here.
That's true.
And I think it's on the rise, to be honest. One of the facts of life that we have to deal with when we're studying these biblical stories, slavery happened. And it's no different for the Israelites than it is for anybody else. Polygamy happens. It's interesting that Abram only has one wife, but he is going to take a concubine who's a slave. His son will have two wives, or his grandson will have four, 2 wives, 2 concubines. Big polygamy happens, slavery happens, misogyny happens, war happens. These things happen.
That's right.
And if you read the Bible as telling us how things ought to be, right? As every word telling us how things ought to be. Not as a moral instruction, not as a way of revealing God and so forth, but as every word telling us how things ought to be. Then wives should be submissive to their husbands. And all of these things ought to be in place. This is the way God's put it. But if you read the Bible as simply reflecting the realities of the world in which these stories are taking place and being written, well, yes, there's misogyny, but that doesn't mean it's right. And yes, there are wars ongoing, but that doesn't mean they're right. Yes, there's slavery, but that doesn't mean God likes slavery. And that becomes a real issue for interpreting the scripture today. And if you read it as every word is sacred and inviolable and something that we have to follow every day, then you have to be open to misogyny and slavery and all types of racism, or at least bigotry. But that's not how we're reading it. We're reading it as an ancient story, and within all of the things we don't like, the misogyny, particularly in this story, the slavery, the imagination that other cultures, have 9 heads and are awful people who eat their babies. All of that stuff. We're not saying that that's true about the Egyptians. We're not saying that's how it ought to be. But we're saying that this is the world in which they were living. And within that world, you can start to see a few things. First of all, migrants are so disempowered that even the strongest, most noble of them have to make some compromises and concessions they would otherwise never make in order to survive. And that's not on them. That's on the system that requires that of humans to even live and survive. And that's how I'm really pressing us to read this story. Any other questions you have, either on the Zoom or here in the room at this point? Okay, so Bobby, you spent last weekend down at
I just got back last night from Tijuana. I was there for 5 days.
Okay. What I'd like to ask you to do, and I'm not going to do it right this minute, but next week, could you take a few moments at the beginning of our Wednesday? Are you going to be?
We're going to be away.
Okay. let's talk. I wanna capture you talking about that a little bit, maybe make it part of my video on Monday or something like that.
Okay.
So we'll find a time to do that. But that's a nice modern moment, where, you know, we need to know more what that migrant experience.
It was a really rich experience.
Great, great.
Amazing.
Okay. All right. Anything else? Let's close with prayer. Gracious God, we are thankful that you give us inquiring minds where we can poke and prod and doubt and question and ooh and ah at the power of these stories. May our hearts be broken by the cruelty that we often exact on the migrant experience. May our hearts be lifted up by the moments that triumph and good comes out of it. May our eyes be open to the realities of the world in which we live and guide us in our participation in it. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. So again, thanks everybody. You probably didn't get a full night's sleep last night with all the rockets red glare, but here you are. And thank you all for being here. And thanks to you who joined us on the Zoom.